I bring you greetings from the Boston Society of Architects. Our president, Laura Wernick, is here, and also our incoming president for next year, Mike Davis, is here. And I hope you all have a chance to meet them afterwards. They're both terrific people, and we're lucky to have them. I'd also like to thank the Barr Foundation and the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University for their support today. 40 years ago, almost exactly to this day, Governor Frank Sargent released the results of a groundbreaking transportation policy review that changed the way we think about our roads and our cities forever. It halted several interstate highways that were planned to slice through greater Boston from Milton to Lynn, and shifted policy to public transportation instead, prodded by an unlikely coalition of community activists, environmentalists, and good government types, and by Mayor Kevin White, who was challenging Governor Sargent for re-election. Sargent's decision was really politics at its very best. I'd like to take a second to remember two people that we lost recently, who I think really embody the spirit of this time. Dave Davis, the director of the Massachusetts Port Authority, who changed that behemoth agency's relationship with its neighbors really for the better. And Jane Holtz-Kay, author of Asphalt Nation, tireless advocate for cities and for the Boston that she loved. It's with their sense of commitment that we convene today. So I'm going to tell you briefly about this program this morning. We have a short presentation for you, after which I'll be back to introduce the panel. We want this event to be a conversation, okay? So we're going to be calling on people in the audience to add their thoughts and hopes and concerns, and we'll be recording those. You'll see them printed up on the screen behind us, and then all of it will be captured in a website that Northeastern University is developing, so we can have a permanent archive of this important time. So in 2 minutes, I'll be back. I'll be introducing our panel. We'll have a discussion for about an hour. Then we have some small tokens of appreciation that we'd like to present, and then we will reconvene for a very yummy and quite lavish reception that we'll be having outside in our gallery, and I hope you'll also take a look through the gallery. It's a terrific space. So first, to put us all in the right frame of mind, we have a brief presentation from Daniel Sullivan. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Daniel is a graduate student in urban and regional policy at Northeastern University. Daniel?
Put up a parking lot with a pink hotel, a boutique, and a swinging hot spot. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone? It pays paradise, put up a parking lot.
Special report, highways or mass transit, the governor decides. From the studios of WCVB TV, here is the governor of the Commonwealth, Francis W. Sargent.
I present to you tonight decisions touching the lives of all of us. The problems of transportation have held us prisoner for 40 years, and recently that captivity has become intolerable. You, your family, your neighbors have become caught in a system that's fouled our air, ravaged our cities, choked our economy, and frustrated every single one of us. To move ourselves, our goods, and our services, we've built more and more and bigger and better superhighways and expressways. They seemed the easiest, the most obvious answer to our multiplying needs. What we misunderstood was what those highways would create: massive traffic congestion. We found that we had defeated our own purpose and that we had been caught in a vicious cycle. More cars meant more highways, which meant more traffic jams. More traffic jams meant the need for more highways, which meant more traffic jams and the need for superhighways. Shall we build more expressways through cities? Shall we forge new chains to shackle us to the mistakes of the past? No. We will not repeat history. We shall learn from it. We will not build the expressways. Instead, we will embark on a nearly $2 billion program blending the best interests of our state, not merely in transportation, but in our economy, and more important, in the quality of our lives from now to beyond the start of a new century.
In the wake of that, Professor Altschuler traveled to Washington, D.C. to help create new federal legislation that for the first time allowed highway gasoline tax monies to be used for public transit. The Red Line extensions to Alewife and Braintree, the relocated Orange Line, many other regional transit improvements are the result. Steve Crosby is chairman of the Massachusetts State Gaming Commission. Yes, this is the same Steve Crosby who was Secretary of Administration and Finance for Governor Jane Swift, a dean of the McCormick Graduate School at UMass Boston, campaign manager for Kevin White's 1979 race for mayor. I mean, the man seems not to be able to hold a job. And even an early investor in the real paper. He was also a policy advisor to Governor Sargent when he must have been about 20 years old and just coming off a stint as a Vista volunteer in Boston's neighborhoods. He's a terrific public servant and proof that you can be bipartisan in Boston. David Dixon is a principal in the well-known architectural firm Goody Clancy. He specializes in planning and urban design, and his work has included planning for the new MBTA Fairmont line and the Four Point waterfront where we sit today. He's an author of the article in this issue of the magazine that, for which this forum is named, Road Work Ahead. It lays out the transportation challenges that we face today, which are very different than those of 1970s. Now it's climate change and demographic pressures. And the article calls for a new public conversation to develop a visionary transportation plan for the 21st century, and perhaps we're having that right now. Stephanie Pollack is an associate director of the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern University, where she works on transportation policy, sustainability, transit-oriented development, and related issues. I think I first met her when she was staff attorney at the Conservation Law Foundation in its glory days. Her piece in this issue considers the unkept promises of the Transportation Review. From underdevelopment of the Melnia-Cass Boulevard area to the stalled extension of the Blue Line to Lynn. Okay, and our moderator today, hooray, Michael Dukakis, distinguished professor at Northeastern University and 3-time governor of Massachusetts. Indeed, he needs no introduction from me. But you might be interested to know that as a mere pup in the Massachusetts legislature, as a state representative from Brookline, he sponsored a bill in 1969 calling for a highway moratorium that attracted over 400 people to its public hearing and was partly responsible for prodding this decision that started all of this. So even as a young man, Governor Dukakis preferred public transit to driving. I give you Governor Dukakis.
Thank you. Thanks, Ray, and thank you all, and thanks to the BSA for hosting this back when most of you weren't born. I had a very close working relationship as a legislator with the Boston Society of Architects, because in those days, folks, the only people that got architectural commissions for state buildings were folks that paid off at campaign time. And as a result of that, and I'm not kidding you, as a result of that, in a city with some of the finest architects in the world, none of them would seek state work. And there were a handful of firms, I can even tell you their names and I won't, that got that work. And not surprisingly, this state had the most undistinguished collection of public buildings in America, most of which leaked after 2 or 3 years, I kid you not. And I thought it was time to do something about that. And the Designer Selection Board was the result, but if it hadn't been for the BSA and the good work of this organization and the people that led it at the time, we would never had it. So it's great to be here and great to be in this center. Some of you have remarked on my informal dress this morning. You know, one of the things about being an ex-governor is you can wear anything you goddamn well please. And I hate ties as much as you. So it's great to be here. And to kind of look out at this audience, I mean, it's the story of my life as I look at all of you. It's amazing. Actors here. I'm just going to start with a question to each of our panelists from your left to right, which seems obvious. I want you to keep your answers as short as possible. But I suspect all of us had a moment of truth or 2 or 3 about this whole thing. And you have to understand, Bill Sargent is here. Bill, where are you? Frank Sargent's son, who's a wonderful guy. You got to understand what was happening in this city and all cities all over America at the time. They were declining, they were deteriorating, people were essentially disinvesting in them, in part because we were building this network of highways which invited a lot of folks to get out. And Boston was an angry city. It was a declining city, it was a dirty city, and cities really were places to put highways through. And not just the so-called master highway plan. We were going to pave over the Victory Gardens and the Fens for parking for the Red Sox because they threatened to leave town. Some of us thought another good left-handed pitcher might make more sense. Nothing has changed, but and it almost happened. And if it hadn't been for a gutsy little Irishman from South Boston named John Powers, who was the Senate president at the time, it would have happened. I mean, there are heroes all over the place, many of whom are in this room. And of course, in many ways, the greatest hero of all was Frank Sargent, who not only reversed himself, not an easy thing to do in politics, folks, but made what I think was one of the most gutsy decisions in the history of the politics of this state when he made that statement. The entire establishment was for this. I mean, you had to do it. You had to build the highways. The city would die if you didn't build the highways. And the movement to stop it was really quite remarkable. It started in little places, neighborhoods, and so forth. One of the heroes was a guy named Thomas P. O'Neill, Jr. And if it hadn't been for Tip, I don't know that this would have happened. And the fact that we became the first state in the country to be permitted to use its interstate highway money for public transportation was a result of that guy and our congressional delegation, but especially Tip, that made it possible for Fred and me to go out so many of you, and really invest in a first-class public transportation system, which now serves us. And I don't want to go on at great length, but the seminal moment for me in all of this was in 1960, when I had just taken the bar exam, graduated from Harvard Law School. One of my classmates was Anthony Scalia. Just want to throw that in. Even then, he was to the right of Marie Antoinette. Anyway, and I and my pal Paul Bronis decided to drive out to Los Angeles in Bronis's little Carmen gear to go to the convention and watch our guy Kennedy get the nomination. And it was a great convention, folks. I couldn't wait to get out of Los Angeles. Even in 1960, it was obvious that the freeways weren't working. And living in Los Angeles in 1960 was like living in a toxic stew. I mean, I'm not kidding you. Walking down the street, eyes burning, tearing. Kids weren't let out for recess because it was unhealthy. And I came back, didn't run for the legislature for another couple of years. I came back and said, if that's the future, I don't want this city that I love to be a part of it. Now, I suspect all of us up here had, if not moments of truth, things that we saw, observed, thought about, that convinced us that there was something better. So, Alan, let's start with you. How did you come to the point where you did the kind of work that you did? And it was great work.
Well, I came to this rather by accident. I got a call from Al Kramer, one of the great heroes of this story.
Who, by the way, sends his regrets. Unfortunately, he's in California, otherwise he'd be here.
Asking me out of the blue, because I didn't know him, I didn't know Sargent, I had had no involvement in Massachusetts public affairs, if I would chair a task force to review the highway and transit controversies of the Boston area. And I said, no, I don't think so. I have a lot to do and I don't have time to do this. And he said, would it make a difference if the governor called you? I said, I don't know. A day or two later, the governor called me. And I said, well, Governor, you know, I've been involved in one or two of these in the past. And if we came up with unpalatable recommendations, the report would go on a shelf somewhere and not even get not even be released to the newspapers. And he said, no, I'm really serious about this. I'm not sure what to do. And I said, I'll tell you what, if you will enable me to have a staff director of my own choosing who can really work on this, since I'm going to be very part-time pro bono in this activity, and that became Jack Wofford. And if you will promise that you will publish the report when we're done, I'll do it. And he said yes. And then for the next 5 months, when anybody asked him about the highways, he said, I'm waiting for my task force report. And then in the beginning of January, this is about four months later, we came in and we recommended the highway moratorium. And we had a rather blistering report about the highway plans. And we said, but you can't just kill the highways. You've got to think about what's going to come next. So you've got to propose what we call the Boston Transportation Planning Review, to take a look over the next several years at what should be the right transportation plan for Boston. And this provoked a tremendous fight in the governor's office, a tremendous debate in the governor's office, in which Al Kramer was the great champion of our proposal. And the governor listened and pondered and finally decided at the end, yes, he was going to do it. And he went on statewide television. And he called John Volpe, his predecessor, who had been a great champion of these highways, who had become U.S. Secretary of Transportation, from whom we were hoping to get the money to do the Boston Transportation Planning Review. About a half hour before he went on television, Volpe was furious. And if I can just have another minute. So a few days later, we flew down to Washington and had a meeting in the office of the vice president, which I guess was vacant, and Volpe, as a cabinet secretary, was able to commandeer for this meeting. And so we get there.
Vacant because?
Well, the vice president doesn't use it all the time. It's not his primary office. It's his.
We had a vice president.
It's
We have a
his.
vice president at that time?
I thought,
It was his. No.
Spiro Agnew took a break.
Yeah, I think he was. I think Agnew. I think Agnew was still. He was not at this meeting. We were just allowed to use that. So
I want to say he was only half Greek. And he wasn't even Greek Orthodox, so that was part of his problem. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, we're all glad to hear that, Mike. Anyway, so we go into this office, and Sergeant and I and a couple of other people are waiting, and Volpe sweeps in with his entourage, and he starts berating Sergeant. And he says, "Frank, how could you do this? What are you doing? This is crazy." And Sergeant, who always called Volpe governor, even though Volpe called Sergeant Frank, just said, "Well, Governor, you got to listen to the people." And Volpe, who I had never met, swirled around. He stuck his finger at me and he said, "Frank, you're listening to the wrong people." But Sergeant went forward and we did the Boston Transportation Planning Review, and John Volpe gave us the money to do the Boston Transit over the vigorous objections of the Federal Highway Administrator and the Federal Transit Administrator, who was in the pocket of the Federal Highway Administrator. Why don't I stop there? We can talk.
Steve,
Well,
moments for you.
yeah, I have to do a little amending of history here. Governor Dukakis spoke so glowingly of Governor Sargent and said he made this incredibly courageous decision. Bill Sargent and I'm sure, remember that a mere 2 years later, Governor Dukakis, then Representative Dukakis, ran against Governor Sargent. I was Governor Sargent's campaign manager, and Governor Dukakis defeated that heroic Governor Sargent. So let's... Right, the price of Hamburg, exactly. There was actually a moment. I was a Vista volunteer. I was the executive director of an organization called Fund. Mel, you may remember. Fund stood for, if you can believe it, Fund for Urban Negro Development. And we were closely affiliated with what was then called the Boston Black United Front, which was run by Chuck Turner. And we were very, very close in collaboration with the leadership of the Black United Front, including Mel. And then along came this attempt to build the Southwest Corridor in the Inner Belt that was going to devastate big chunks of the South End, and what a surprise, mostly the black communities, many of the black communities in Boston. And so via that relationship, I started talking to the membership of Fund, which was a suburban white membership, about whether or not we could get involved in this. And being dutiful, just barely out of college kid that I was, I actually got the, was it 1956 master plan? What was the date of the highway master plan?
62. There was a 56 agreement.
It was a, okay, well, whatever it was, but I actually got the big plan. And I read it, and even I could tell that it was utter self-fulfilling nonsense. It basically said there's more traffic, which requires more highways, and more highways will require more traffic, will generate more traffic, and more traffic will generate more highways. And it was a totally circular, even to a totally uneducated, untutored mind on this, it was nonsensical. Interestingly, and as for lessons, I had the same feeling that Neil Sheehan had and wrote about in his book, A Bright Shining Lie, about the military's mindset about the war in Vietnam. And I had the same reaction when, as Secretary of Administration and Finance, I read a consultant report on rising healthcare costs by a healthcare consultant firm. Basically said prices are so high because costs are so high, and therefore we have to keep our prices high. I mean, it was this same kind of utterly circular, utterly illogical thinking when you relied on the experts to, and the experts alone, to make policy. So it wasn't just, from my standpoint, it wasn't just the group of people that I was working with and getting caught up in this incredible gestalt of this anti-highway movement. It was an extraordinary time, and seeing these faces and people involved in it is amazing, and would that there were other here that I think of. Father Corrigan, I could go on and talk about people. Abe Plotkin on the other side of it. Anyway, it was beyond just that gestalt and the politics of it. I really did have an awareness that this was an utterly irrational, but nobody had the nerve to step back and say, you know what, the emperor has no clothes at all. It was a breakthrough moment.
Great, Steve. And there were other things happening around the country that I think had an impact on us. Jack Kennedy was elected president. And the D.C. Master Highway Plan, if you can believe this, had a super highway right down the mall. Serious. And so the President of the United States, who obviously was living fairly close to this, started raising questions. And then in San Francisco, God loves San Francisco.
The NIMBY role of the president.
God love San Francisco. The San Francisco Master Highway Plan essentially had its version of the Central Artery. It was called the Embarcadero Highway. From the south to the north, connecting the freeway system from the south with the Golden Gate Bridge. You had to do it, right? Where? Right in front of that gorgeous harbor separating the city from its harbor with an 8-lane elevated highway. Sound familiar? And protests began, and a congressman named Jack Shelley, who happened to be a labor leader before he became a congressman, was elected mayor. And Shelley came to the conclusion that they just weren't going to finish the Embarcadero Highway, and announced that to Caltrans, the state transportation agency, which was outraged. Outraged. Not to mention the federal people. I don't know who at the time was Secretary of Transportation. Maybe it was.
Well, there wasn't yet a Secretary of Transportation. There was no department. There was only there was the Federal Highway Administration. DOT was created a few years later.
And some of you may remember the Embarcadero sat there, hanging, until 1987. Was it 87 or 89? I can't remember, when the good Lord sent an earthquake. That cracked the damn thing. And by that time, Art Agnos, another fine Greek American on both sides, who, by the way, grew up in Springfield, but by that time was mayor, said, this sounds like a good opportunity to tear the goddamn thing down. And he did. And now there's a kind of vintage trolley line which works commercially and has, by the way, an old Boston Elevated Street Railway car as one of its many cars, which not only tore the Embarcadero down, but opened up that gorgeous harbor and seafront, if you will, to what is an absolutely delightful urban space. So those things were happening as well.
So, Mike, there's a coda to that story, and that is San Francisco was able to do this because they had a local veto. Subsequently, the U.S. Congress prohibited local vetoes in states that were going to be able to do this, and some states still had it. Frank Sargent actually made part of his reputation at the Department of Public Works by getting the state legislature to pass legislation making clear there was no local veto in Massachusetts. And so the power to deal with this was fully at the state level. And that's one of the reasons why he became the first governor in America to be a governor who stopped the road as opposed to a locality that stopped the road.
David.
Well, first of all, I have to say I grew up in the toxic stew of Los Angeles and was there a kid in 1960, so I now understand some of my problems today. Thank you. And I say I get to dress informally because I'm sitting next to a governor and once went out and worked for him when he was a candidate for something else. So, and I have to say, I'm sitting next to a man with the most remarkable memory on this earth for names. I was once walking, coming from New Haven back to Boston on the Acela, walking down a totally darkened car, going to get some tea so I could stay awake. And all of a sudden I hear this voice say, David? And it is our former candidate for president and governor, and I had no idea he even knew who I was, which was really impressive. But so I'm going to see. I am most profoundly thankful for BTPR because it gave me my first jobs. I got to work on some of the projects when I moved to Boston. I moved here because it was a lifestyle decision. I thought I moved here in 1976, and I thought, well, you know, if I really wanted a career, I'd go to Houston. But Boston, it has history. It's walkable. It's in decline. But I'm gonna live near the beach. I don't know. And I got lucky. Boston turned out to be the future, and not Houston. And it turned out to be the future, and not Houston, because of what a lot of the folks in this room did. And for that, I am profoundly thankful because you gave me a life and a career, in addition to a great city to live in. What has been most remarkable to me is that, and I'm going to speak in terms of you. I'm not really much younger than the rest of you, but I'll get to pretend. Is that a group of you did something that we haven't been able to do for the next 40 years, and very few other places have done. Now granted, we were desperate, but still, given, as the governor said, the absolute prevailing wisdom, to go against the prevailing wisdom, no matter who you are, let alone an elected official, is pretty remarkable. You don't have any cover. And so it takes just plain courage, and I'm remarkably respectful of that. when I look forward and at both Boston and the rest of our country, I see reasons today that are more profound than we faced in that period. And it's not so much that we're in decline now, but where do we want to be in 10 years, let alone 40 years? This country is educating roughly half of the folks that Kendall Square and along with that period that our knowledge area industries need going forward. And I can tell you from the work we do around the country, these industries will get up and move in 5 minutes if they think their labor is going to be someplace else. And there are a lot of other regions out there doing everything they can to have great main streets and more multifamily housing and more density, and frankly trying to figure out to plot a transit. Columbus, Ohio is paying a whole lot more attention to its regional transit future because it sounds a little elitist. I apologize. They want to attract those folks. So I think we live in a global economy where we're going to have to compete much harder. Even Harvard and MIT, we just finished a plan for Kendall Square, and I can tell you those companies will get up and leave, and I don't mean come over to Boston, if they think their labor wants to be in Seattle and San Francisco, because they come and ask us, what's our planning like in Seattle? Secondly, I have a very good friend named Kate Benfield who works for NRDC, who points out that a couple of years ago this country used 25% of the fossil fuel energy used in this world, but sadly we only had 4% of the population. That would be fine if another 2 billion people hadn't decided they want to become middle class over the next 20 or 30 years and spend a lot of money on energy, meaning clearly resilience, climate change, sustainability are all very important things, but we have a more immediate concern. We're not going to be able to afford a fossil fuel-based transportation system. We can't afford. This country spends more on gas than food now by about 40%. 12 years ago, we spent considerably less on gas than food. That's a very short period. Folks who live in suburban neighborhoods without any access to transit in this country now spend more than a quarter of their disposable income, excuse my voice here, on transportation. You know, they spend about 30% on housing. That's getting awfully close. Folks who live in, the heart of Boston, places served by what you all did, spend maybe 10% of their disposable income. We can't afford, no region can be in a position to afford to make a lot of us have to pay 25 or 30% when we could be paying 10%. No matter how much we invested in transit, it would be a good deal in terms of A, the impact on folks here, but equally A, in terms of attracting the brains that we need to succeed going forward. And lest I sound like a complete elitist, I'm going to finish on social equity. So, I see one of my wonderful colleagues from some work we've been doing in Central Square. And one of the things that I have found just remarkable about that process is here are a group of folks who get the fact that if they don't create a lot more housing, I'll use a word which we don't quite use in public, but density, to really open up that housing market, to allow a lot more folks to live near transit. Central Square, the average person, the average household in Central Square, not the average, the 1/7 that population moves every year. Every time 1/7 moves out, the 1/7 who moves in are much more affluent. Central Square is gentrifying itself, and it's gentrifying its long-term residents out of the ability to live there because it doesn't have enough housing. When they leave, they go to places that aren't transit served. Then they have to spend a lot more of their income on transportation. I think everybody here also knows that a walkable environment is far healthier, partly because you don't get hit by cars as often, but for lots of reasons. So we are basically sending people, when we don't invest in transit, we are sending people who aren't these bright young folks who can command tremendous incomes out to live in less healthy and much more expensive lives when they don't have the resources in the first place. If given the costs of personal transportation, it costs the average household, I'm going to reverse this. We did a plan for 37 miles of new streetcars in Washington, D.C. And Harriet Trigoni, as the planning director, said, the first thing she said is, do not make this sound like a gentrification initiative. I'm about to have a new mayor who's running against gentrification, and I won't have a job. So, all right. So we looked at what are all the non-investment benefits. Well, it turns out that it costs about $9,600 a year to own one additional car in D.C. on average, not just a brand new car. if you can give folks access to reliable transportation, that's like giving folks a $4,000 to $5,000, $6,000 subsidy in DC. No matter what we projected in terms of income increases in housing values because of transit, folks in neighborhoods that would get streetcar service would save money. They became more affordable. And we can keep extending this out. We owe it to ourselves and a lot of folks who can't afford cars. They won't be able to get to jobs. Transportation is literally competing with food at this point. So if we want to compete as a region, if we want to be fair, and frankly, if we want to be the kind of place we want to be, we got to do it again. So good luck and have fun and lead us again. Thank you.
Stephanie.
So I want to sort of make 3 quick points because we want to pull other folks into the conversation. You know, I wrote a piece for the magazine. I had the pleasure of rereading Alan Lupo's wonderful book, Rights of Way. I've talked to a lot of people, and there are 3 things about what happened 40 years ago that struck me that I think are worth sort of putting on the table as we think about what we should learn and what we should do going forward. So the first that strikes me, especially because I sit in a university and I spend a lot of my time teaching young people, is the age of the people who took the leadership positions during the struggle. You know, they were the age of my kids. They're the age of my students. The fact that we're here 40 years later and they are still so youthful tells you how young they had to be, right, when they were doing this. And I think that, you know, I'm at the tail end of the boomer generation, and the boomers have occupied a huge amount of space and air. We need young people to feel as empowered as that generation did, to just sort of elbow us aside and say, you got it wrong, we got it right, and we don't, you know, this is the youth over, you know, beauty. So so that was the first thing, is you know, you read, you'll see the pictures at the end when Renee does it, you look at, you know, Al Kramer and Barty Frank and everyone, and it was wonderful. So we need more of that. I think we need more of that. I think we've actually marginalized some of young people's energies by sort of not getting out of their way. The second thing that strikes me is that the process first of stopping the roads, but then more importantly of the BTPR, redefined the way we think about expertise, right? The reason many of you know I spent decades doing environmental work, and I've spent the last decade only doing transportation work. And the reason I love transportation, and I tell this to the community groups I work with, everyone is an expert on transportation. Everyone gets places every single day. Everybody has to figure out how to get to work and how to get their kids to school and after school programs and where they're going to get their groceries. And everybody actually has opinions, and they are meaningful opinions. And the BTPR said, we are going to take seriously everyone's ideas. We're going to put them through a rigorous screen. We're going to evaluate them the way that they have to be evaluated by engineers. But the fact that the idea originated with a community group as opposed to a transportation consulting firm is not only problematic, it's a good thing. And many of the ideas that emerged in the final BTPR documents, which I have had the pleasure of reading, and which we are in the process of digitizing and putting on the web, because I will tell you, they're the freshest 40-year-old documents that you can read. You read them, and somebody should tell the Congress for New Urbanism that somebody did it 40 years ago, and they're just repeating the same thing.
First of all, I agree.
So, so I think that that's an important thing for all us to remember as a region as we move ahead and plan what I hope will be the next generation of transformative investments, that people, a very wide variety of people, actually have a lot to say. And the experts were wrong. The traditionally defined experts wrote that plan that Steve Crosby read and you know, not, without knowing anything, said, this is nonsense. We need more of that. We need to sort of take common sense back from so-called experts and assert what makes sense for people. And then the third thing that I will say, and then I'll turn it back to Governor Dukakis, is the other thing that strikes one from the perspective of having grown up a little bit later is that it wasn't just about no. If the story had ended on February of 1970 when the governor made the no speech, right, would have been nearly as interesting a story. That speech we played for you wasn't the no speech, it was the yes speech of 2 years later, where he said, yes, we are going to invest in transit. Yes, we are going to do things differently. We are, as we all know, really bad at yes right now. As a civic society, we have lost the ability to reach consensus and do stuff. We're really good at blocking each other's priorities and terrible at setting that aside and moving ahead as a group. And obviously that applies way beyond transportation, but in the specific case of transportation, we need the new yes. We need to be able to ask ourselves, when folks gather in a room like this 40 years from now, are they going to be able to celebrate the things that we initiated now, or are they going to look back and say, we undid all the progress that was made by the BTPR because we simply rested on those laurels and we simply fought everything we didn't like and we didn't put forth an affirmative plan for making the investments that would transform the region for the 21st century.
Great, Stephanie. I have one additional question for the panel. Doesn't require more than a sentence answer.
Good luck, Governor.
Yeah, good luck.
No.
You may be the governor, but try to get him to one sentence.
Give you two, but no more. Anyway, is there a single, I mean, already heard from Stephanie about this, and some more than one important lesson there. But from a personal standpoint, is there a single important lesson from this experience that you'd want to communicate to the new generation of policymakers? And some of you have already suggested this. I'll start. Don't hesitate to challenge the establishment if you think they're wrong. If your instincts tell you that there's something wrong with this thing, act on that. And don't buy into the notion that they know better than you do or we do. That's the lesson I carried from this. Alan.
Let me build on what Stephanie was saying, what you were saying too, but particularly what Stephanie was saying. I think it's important to understand that the BTPR was a civil deliberation in which all of the stakeholders did come together and in civil fashion, with the aid of marvelous experts who they helped to select, by the way, they had a 2-year deliberation about this. That did not produce consensus. You shouldn't think easy consensus came out of this. There was, in fact, intense polarization at the end and much debate as everybody tried to lobby the governor for their position. But the governor made some very strong, clear, well-reasoned decisions at the end. And the result was that everybody accepted them, including the losers. The great worry when the governor made his decision was that the pro-highway people would kill the transit program in the legislature and we wouldn't be able to go forward. But in fact, because of that deliberation, the pro-highway people said, well, that game is over. And if we want transportation, we better get behind this plan that has emerged, and we understand the process, we understand the reasoning, and they did get behind it. And so the result was we didn't have the business and labor communities who had so favored the highways opposing the transit program over the next decade or so. But in fact, they were part of the coalition, and that was because of the nature of the discourse and deliberation that I think had led to that decision. That's the lesson that I would take away.
Steve.
I was going to say the one we've already talked about, which is don't leave planning and policy development to the experts. So I'll give another one, and that is hire brilliant, uncompromising staff. This would never, ever have happened if the Republican governor hadn't hired a smart, young, liberal Jewish state rep from Chelsea to be his policy advisor. Never would have happened without Al Kramer, and who then went on and hired Guy Rossman. And in the mayor's office in those days, was, believe it or not, in the same building or same administration, was a guy named Barney Frank and a guy named Fred Salvucci. I mean, if they put a group of people like that, you don't need to be Kevin White or Frank Sargent or Governor Dukakis. You've got guys like that around. You can't lose. So hire brilliant, uncompromising staff would be the second lesson I would have. As
all of whom got along extraordinarily well across the partisan divide in those years.
Yeah.
And I might add, with formidable political skills.
Formidable.
Great intelligence, but formidable political skills, all of them. David.
I guess looking back and maybe trying to look forward, the one thing I would add, I strongly agree with Stephanie on, in fact, every time, as I'm listening, I'm thinking, what mistakes are I and we making now that 40 years from now we'll look back upon? And I think the best protection we have is to always remember there is no one perspective that trumps others. It is always about social equity, it is about transportation, it's about economic development, and we need, apropos of what I think you both said, a lot of different brains at the table representing different perspectives who find a way to dialogue as opposed to sometimes one strong lead around a single issue, because I think that's when we are most likely to really get in trouble.
Stephanie? Final word?
So the final word, two things that seem very apropos for this. One is leadership matters. There was, what the governor did made a huge difference. And sometimes somebody's just got to step up to the plate, and we need more, not less of that. And then the final thing that I would say that also, again, strikes me, given where we stand today, is it wasn't that no one thought about where the money would come from for the projects. People gave thought to it. But the projects and the power of the vision was the tool by which the money was found to implement the vision.
Great
We
point.
start now with money, and we only plan when we think we already have the money to build what we're planning, and that is quite simply backwards. We need to plan for that which we want and need, and then build the consensus to find the money to pay for it. We are really stuck on the money thing right now.
Great. Okay, we're going to go out in the audience and ask 4 people who played enormously important roles in this, and continue to do so, for a comment from them, and then we'll open it up to all of you. Jack, you've already been identified as the guy that drove this process at the head of the review. We've never had, where's Jack?
It's right there, right there.
Right. We haven't had anything quite like this since, here or elsewhere, for that matter. Is that because the conclusions of the BTPR essentially set the pattern in a pretty impressive way, so that we've kind of tried to work within the framework that you created? Or do we need something like this again? What do you think?
Well, I think the pattern that was created,
Yeah.
is easy to forget, in the sense that the BTPR was both about outcome, which was not the result of consensus, but process. And the process piece, I went on to a career as mediator and consensus builder, so this was my laboratory and learning experience. I think the process points of assembling people with differences around a table and designing a study that was committed to developing all the major alternatives to equal levels of detail, with decision in the end to be made by the governor. So it was an advisory process, which to me gave it great strength, actually, and built on a steering group of about 20 people, stakeholders from all sides, about the outcome, who agreed for the 3 years of the restudy unanimously on every issue of process. And it really began, as Alan was saying, when we actually had to decide what's the scope of this restudy. Right? It sounds like a kind of arcane question, but it became critical, because what we decided to do, met summer evenings at MIT, was to assemble all the stakeholders and say, we want you to help shape this study process. And they came out of it with a design that none of the experts who had, knew the highway plan and the transit plan would have come up with. And one of the key things they came up with was, let's make sure that 10% of the budget is devoted to technical assistance and community liaison. And out of that component of the restudy, some things occurred that you all know and are using. For example, taking the red line on its way to LA via Davis Square. That came out of the technical assistance component of the re-study. Similarly, the location of the Third Harbor Crossing came out of the experts coming back from being screamed at in East Boston and said, no, 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 don't just move it to Jeffrey's Point or move it around a little bit. Come back and show us an alternative that takes no houses and no business. And I'll tell you, riding back in from that evening meeting, the third time we'd been out to East Boston, and the experts were saying, this is impossible, there's nothing there. And then there was this silence, and suddenly one of those aha moments came, and someone said, well, what if it came up on airport property? There was this silence, like, ooh, now there's an interesting idea. So the combination, as Stephanie was saying, of the experts who have a role, but a process that was devoted to developing the alternatives to equal levels of detail, taking values and creativity from the community and translating it into viable alternatives. So in the end, the governor had a build alternative. It wasn't a build or no build choice that he had. He had an array of positive alternatives. And I think the process point is so easily forgotten that if you put people around a table and create a place where they can speak about what their underlying concerns are and not have to agree on outcome, that they can come up with some things that you never would have expected. So I think that, you know, so many things, the Southwest Corridor that Tony Barrow managed for some years, all those outcomes were in nobody's mind at the start of the re-study, and I think it was a process that made it possible.
Great, thanks, Jack. I was smiling when you were talking about the Third Harbor Tunnel because I was dead set against it. And I was about 40 points ahead in the polls going into the primary in 1978 when Ed King ran against me. He was a big, build-it guy. And we were stuck outside the Sumner Tunnel because we didn't have the good sense at that point to get rid of the tolls on the other side. The best and the cheapest thing I ever did. And there was a cabbie next to me.
In a history of cheap things.
Oh. I'm frugal. Kitty says I'm the cheapest guy in the world. I said, well, I'm frugal. My kids threatened to do a Costco intervention on me last year. So anyway, in this cabbie, it was hot as hell. We were heading out. I was going someplace. I can't think of it. And he turned to me and said, when are you going to build that third tunnel? And I thought I was in pretty good shape, 40 points ahead in the polls and all this kind of stuff. There was about 5 weeks to go, and they said, we already got one. It's called the Blue Line. Ah, jeez. I knew I was in trouble. And then when I got back in, Fred came along and said, here's a way to do it that doesn't take any houses, any businesses. The rest, as they say, is history. Is Rich Davey here? Where's the secretary?
Rich was not able to make it, I think, so we should...
I don't know, Jeff, whether I ought to ask you to stand in for him.
Sure.
But,
go for that.
The question, his predecessor, Jeff Mullen, who graces us with his presence here today, and did a terrific job for us. Question I've been asked to ask Rich is whether today we can accomplish the same kind of transformative change that occurred 40 years ago. I don't know how many of you noted Secretary Davies' public statement 3 or 4 weeks ago, which I thought was as important as anything, possible exception my friend Salvucci used to do on a daily basis, but all kidding aside, and I like the Secretary of Transportation a lot, in which he basically said, folks, the era of highway building is over. We're not spending one more dime on the expansion of that system. From now on, it's public transportation, it's your own transportation, it's bicycles. That's where we're going, which sounded to me, folks, like a pretty transformative statement. Jeff, you want to comment on that at all? Where are you? Jeff Mullen, everybody. On what Rich said. Yeah, maybe you don't.
Or Jeff, you can give your own opinion on whether.
Yeah, forget about what Rich said, but what are your thoughts looking forward? I mean, is the future pretty well set? Is it now a question of coming up with the resources and going ahead with a number of projects that
Let me answer your question and make 3 points, and then I'll leave it at that. I think the answer to the question on the board is yes, absolutely. There's no question about that. But more importantly, there were really,
talk into the microphone, Jeff.
I'm sorry. There are 3 things. When we designed MassDOT, a lot of it was informed by the Great War that went on for the previous 20 years, with the MBTA general manager not speaking to the governor and the Turnpike Authority at war with the Highway Department, et cetera. And a lot of MassDOT was really about the Governor Patrick's vision of one. I think that MassDOT is still in its formative stages and needs a lot of work to massage that vision. But I think it's important that the war is now ended. And the benefits from the collaboration that you see in MassDOT, envisioned or manifested by something as simple to all of you perhaps, but unimaginable 10 years ago, that Davey would be with DePaula, the highway administrator, and Glenn, the Port Authority director, and Davis, the interim general manager at the T, at Logan talking about Thanksgiving Day traffic. These are people who used to have to check their weapons at the door before they walked into a room at 10 Park Plaza. And we laugh, but we all know that it's true. And frankly, I participated in it, and so did many of you. So MassDOT was about that, and I think that's important. So yes, we can get to that point, but we need to continue with the great project that is the creation of this intermodal transportation organization. Secondly, I think this reinforces for people that promises really matter. So, I talked a lot about Volpe when I was secretary, not because I was enamored with Governor Volpe, but because it was the long arc of transportation that people need to remember the past so that they can look toward the future. These are important questions that call for important and thoughtful answers. And the third is that these things really matter. The decisions that we make have enormous impacts on the landscape within which we live. So, for example, in my living room, I have a picture of Foul Meadow. And I have a picture of Foul Meadow, firstly, because I love the Blue Hills, but secondly, because Foul Meadow wouldn't exist if we had built the Southwest Expressway. And that's a real important reminder for people like me who do things like me. And we also, in my conference room at 10 Park Plaza, we had a rendering of the expressway that was painted by somebody who probably worked for Governor Sargent when he was commissioner of the DPW. These renderings that we now put out on computers, they were painted. And how many people have been in that room? But it shows the expressway with the transit line in the middle of the expressway going right through Jamaica Plain. It's just a fabulous painting about something that never got built. It's just an important reminder. So those are 3 thoughts that I have. But to the point about the main question and the vision that Rich has laid out for no more highway building, I wonder if he asked Governor Patrick before he said that. But that's another point. But the point is, sure, we can do transformation. We can do transformational thing. I think MassDOT is a visionary project that's still in its infancy, but it permits us to get to that next level.
Thanks, Jeff, so much. Thank you. Tony, your name has been taken in vain a number of times here. And you were involved in a remarkable community planning process, which, as Jack pointed out, came up with ideas and proposals that none of us prior to that process, including the so-called experts, apparently even thought about. Talk to us a little bit about that. Is it different now, or can't the same process, at least in this community, work just as effectively?
That's a provocative question. The situation then that I stepped into, I wasn't here during the DPR years. I was asked by Fred initially, and then by Alan to make sense of what the plan was. It had a lot of elements that were really totally necessary. There was a policy in place. We knew what we were asked to do. There were edges around the program. We knew there were no highways. We knew there might be some local streets. But the big piece had to be sketched in. And the big piece was, how do you make transportation planning compatible with community development? So while I appreciate Jeff Mullen's notion that the transportation agencies were reluctant to reach we only knew we had achieved some level of comfort when Ed King, who had run for governor against you in the moment you described, also campaigned on building roads. In fact, he was quite anxious to tell people at the time that he would build the Southwest Expressway and overturn every decision made. Now, most people in the neighborhoods realized it's silly. In fact, it was only when Jimmy O'Leary brought him out to some living rooms in Roslindale, Jimmy was working for Congressman Buckley at the time, that Ed King turned around on the issue because the policy had been in place at that point for 5 years, almost 6, post-BTPR. And when he heard it from the people, he was listening to the right people, I think, at that time. It had become clear, I think, even to him, the most staunch highway advocate one could find at the time, that the policy was really very straightforward and clear. And people didn't want to go backwards. That's an important framework, and I think it's kind of missing today, to answer your question more directly. There is a vague notion that transit is important and that streets and highways take the back seat. But what's missing from the idea is some clarity about what we're trying to accomplish at the end of the day. It's not really about just building transit any more than it should have been really about building highways. It's really about building community. And David's remark, I think it's very telling if you play it out. And we had a framework to play it out back post-BTPR because everyone said we're interested in building neighborhood. Mel said it, Chuck Turner said it. It wasn't lost on Secretary Coleman or Senator Brooke, who carried that notion all the way to Congress and got us the money to build the orange line and the red line. But I think this is the important kernel here. The kernel of truth is that if you're just doing it for its own sake, it's not really substantive enough. It has to be substantive in terms of the outcome. If we're trying to create a livable place, in David Dixon's words, that people want to come to, want to work in. And we hear that now from every employer we talk to. We're coming to Boston and Cambridge because it's the place where our employees want to be. And they're the creative class, not the working sticks that work the doors to work like my father did and sometimes I used to do. These are people who are very different, people like our children. And it's a total view of what it is to be alive. It's not a view about commuting to work in less time or having a way to get home by 5:30. They don't do that. They don't do that. It's all about how you enjoy yourselves. And the distinctions between living and working and commuting and being there are totally blurred. So until we get that point and start planning cities in a coherent way, we're densifying. And that's a really good sign.
Great. Although let's not forget that you might be interested in a recent report by our Center at Northeastern on the future of manufacturing in Massachusetts, which is quite optimistic. Says we should be able to continue to employ thousands and thousands of people in good manufacturing jobs that pay well and benefits. And that may be less, obviously, in the intermetropolitan area, but in the Pittsburghs and Worcesters and Fall Rivers and other places, that's an important part of our economic mix as well. Back when I and I think 4 of my colleagues in the legislature, now you weren't there at the time, were raising questions about this, I kept saying to these other 4 guys, everybody thinks we're special pleaders because the highways are going through our communities. We've got to find somebody who has some expertise and credibility who's with us. Otherwise, we're going to get killed because all the experts say we're going to do this. And I don't know who it was who said to me, there's this Italian guy that's just come back from a Fulbright in Italy who's working as a planner for Ed Logue at the BRA. I think he agrees with you. I called Fred up, And I even bought him lunch, which for me was... And we had lunch, and I sat listening to this guy who not only agreed with us, but laid out the rationale for killing this stuff and moving in a very different direction absolutely brilliantly, and that's where the two of us first connected. Anyway, you all know him. A last word, Fred, on how you sustain this effort. My sense is that all of the work that was done by so many of you really did create a framework which lived through one administration after another, including King, and has really defined this community in a remarkable way. What are the kinds of things, Fred, you do to try to sustain this as we look forward to another chapter in the history of this Commonwealth? What do you think?
Well, a couple of points to make to get to that.
Why don't you face them from over here?
Okay, a couple of points I'd make to not repeat the terrific display of intellect you just had, but to emphasize a couple of points that were perhaps understated. One is elections matter hugely. Frank Sargent made an incredibly courageous decision to make all of this possible. There's no way there's no way to overstate just how important that was. We're lucky his son is here. But that was tremendously important. Had he not been pressed aggressively by Mike Dukakis, arguing vigorously for the transit side, he might not have had the opportunity to make that decision. Had Mike not convinced Kevin White to make it a plank in the gubernatorial candidacy in 1970, the moratorium wouldn't have been on the table. Had, the risk of being a little politically incorrect, had Bob Quinn been the Democratic candidate instead of Mike Dukakis, this story would have come out very differently. At the airport, we wouldn't have had a Dave Davis. The BTPR would have been upended. That was the game plan. So elections matter, leadership matters. Governor Dukakis mentioned the national scale. Let me add a tiny bit to that. Mayor D'Alessandro in Baltimore blocked one of these wacky highways. His daughter, Nancy Pelosi, is Speaker of the House. Still in a position of power. There are people who remember this stuff that might be part of the solution going forward. At the local level, after the terrific decisions that the governor made, that Governor Sargent made, implementing them was very difficult, and it did rest on the process that Jack Wofford talked about and Alan Altshuler caused to happen. Probably the most influential lobby group to convince Ed King to build the red line and the orange line, hating every minute of it, was the construction interests who had funded his campaign, saying, look, sing that song again about the highways and the good old days, but that was yesterday. These are real jobs and real contracts, and we want them. And the fact that the BTPR was put together with such care, bringing everybody in, resulted in even the people who thought they lost, becoming winners and advocates of getting it done. So the leadership that Alan gave us in crafting the study, BTPR took about 18 months and $1.5 million. It was designed to implement the National Environmental Policy Act. A lot of environmental policy has degenerated into a waste of time designed to never make a decision so you never have to spend the money. Alan designed a process to make decisions and then implement them and built the base to implement them. So what he did cannot be understated. I want to go back to Alan in a minute, but on the local leadership point, a couple of other points. Just say no may begin the conversation, but it doesn't get to yes. In Cambridge, even after
Governor Dukakis was governor and I was charged with implementing a lot of the decisions that came out of the VTPR, I was very dubious that we were ever going to get the Red Line built. Cambridge, once the Unibelt threat was removed, a lot of the neighborhood groups were organizing against the Red Line. North Cambridge, all along Garden Street. We were lucky that Somerville said, they don't want it, we do. Come our way to Davis Square and Davis, to Davis Square and Porter Square, and we could even give you a connection to the commuter rail system at Porter. That came out of Cambridge saying no again, I think quite counterproductively. Fortunately, Somerville had a different attitude. That leadership came from Somerville City Hall to make something happen. Within Cambridge, Jim Sullivan, the city manager, not a guy who ever considered himself a friend of mine, was determined. He thought I was trying to not build the Red Line. He was determined to deal with the opposition in Cambridge and make sure that the Red Line actually happened. He really dug in and worked to make it happen, both as a transit project and in order to build the nice office Alan has now over at the Kennedy School of Government, where the Red Line Yards used to be, and the Charles Hotel. Sullivan poured energy into making sure it happened, and he demanded to be included in, when Alan Altshuler, with me supporting him in the mayor's role, put together the parking freeze as one of the elements of the Clean Air Act. Jim Sullivan, we initially proposed it just in Boston and at Logan. Sullivan demanded to be included because he viewed Kendall Square as becoming a park and ride lot for Boston. It was totally empty and nothing was going on there. Were it not for his insistence on being part of the freeze, you wouldn't see what's going on in Kendall Square that David was so interestingly talking about. I agree with everything he was talking about. Wouldn't be there, except for what Jim Sullivan did. So the local leadership thing, right now, we got a mayor called Curtatone. He's even Italian on both sides. He's struggling very hard to get the Green Line extended, with some reasonable support from Secretary Davey to get it moving, although it's taking longer. These things always take longer than they should. The point is, people who are willing to invest the time and energy to keep moving. Fortunately, Curtatone is one of those. If we had Tony Pangaro managing that corridor, we would not be still futzing around about whether we're going to apply bubble gum to the McGrath Highway elevated so it'll stay up a little bit longer. We'd have a vision for the corridor like Curtatone, that we're going to extend the Green Line, tear down McGrath Highway, make it a boulevard, and build a city there with all of those vacant lots that were, many of them, destroyed for the original Innerville. So the local leadership, you got to get it where you find it. And right now, there's some real leadership in Somerville, and you got to build these things one piece at a time. We got to get that piece done. We've now gone through several cycles where the flavor of the month is, oh, let's talk about the urban ring, and we go to a lot of meetings, and then, oh, we'll put that on the shelf, and then we talk about the missing link of the Silver Line, and oh, that goes on the shelf, and it mustn't happen to the Green Line. It's not the only thing we need, but it's the one that's far enough along we can get it done. We got to get it done, and we get McGrath torn down, so we move forward. I want to go back to Alan, because it does relate to our current situation. Because Alan got through that legislation, it wouldn't have happened without Tip O'Neill. But Tip O'Neill needed a very carefully crafted piece of legislation that Alan, Bob Perry, and Jack Wofford, between them, put together. According to one story, they actually put it together before the BTPR. They can answer that question.
Very early in the BTPR.
But that statute meant that at the end of the planning, we did have the money to implement the Orange Line and the Red Line. We didn't get the Blue Line done, not because the money wasn't there, the money was there, but the local leadership changed its mind. Lynn turns against it, unfortunately, and the Blue Line didn't happen. We should get back to that because it really is needed, but it was the local leadership that was missing. But what Alan did with that statute and working with our terrific delegation was set it up so that if we could get to yes on the thousands of details that Tony Pangaro had to work out to make the Southwest Corridor a reality, the money was there to do it. And that role that Alan played is really got to be understood. In terms of where we go from here, I think recognizing local leadership, where it is, and taking advantage of it, building new leadership, recognizing that elections matter, and trying to get the federal government, one other piece that we haven't talked about. The role of the press is essential. Somebody mentioned Alan Lupo. If we hadn't had Alan Lupo at the Globe covering the community side of this issue, all the damn roads would have been built. If we hadn't had Jack Thomas writing those incredible editorials all through this period supporting the new direction, it wouldn't have happened. The Globe is now at a point of transition in leadership. When the new editor comes in, some subset of the people in this room have to get in that room fast to say, show them the movie, this is what happened, we need the Globe, not to be in, talking about reform before revenue, but talking about reform requires revenue. We're not going to have the MBTA we need without money, and we need an unequivocal voice out of the Globe beating that issue to death. That was part of the mix that happened. And sometimes we act as if the press with this objective kind of lens that's looking at them. The press is a participant. Tom Winship, as editor of the Globe, made a huge difference in these issues. We need to remember that. So those points of leadership are the building blocks that led to success 40 years ago. There are building blocks like that now that we have to be recognizing and reinforcing and taking advantage of the opportunities we have. And maybe trying to get Nancy Pelosi interested in, what do you say we put some real money into transit and do it right? High-speed rail is great, but excuse me, at the end of the high-speed rail, if you go to Europe, the reason high-speed rail works is that there are great transit systems connecting to the high-speed rail. We need some real attention from Washington on making transit a priority. We could do it with some help from Nancy and others. I know I talked too long, I apologize. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. I was smiling as Fred was talking about Joe Curtatone and what's happening over in Somerville. I just add one additional thing to what's needed, and that is tearing down those 17 billboards that Mr. Grabowskis gave us as a going-away present, which is the gateway to Boston from the north. I mean, it's disgraceful, folks. And I hope we won't have flashing ones either. That's a whole other debate that's beginning. Okay, we have about 10 minutes to go out in the audience and kind of take some questions. Hold on, John, just a sec. David.
Listen, there's been a lot of talk about the leadership in this room today. Very deserving talk about that leadership. There hasn't been enough emphasis, however, on the role that the people on this side played throughout. It's worth remembering that during the BTPR process, in parallel, there was something called the Southwest Corridor Land Development Coalition, which was an assembly of people throughout Jamaica Plain, Roxbury, and the South End that came together with a $30,000 grant from model cities. And people like Ken Crookmeyer and Ann Hirschfang and a number of others got involved with that process and developed an option that actually was part of what was eventually accepted in the BTPR as one of the options presented. It was important because this community was proactively involved. They weren't simply passively engaged in the process. They went out, they used the media. We actually had a group of people that went into Frank Sargent's office, and Frank Sargent could count votes. And at a time when this city was roiled by racial divisions, he looked out at a room that had working class white people, African Americans, and others all united around a particular item. And it made a big difference, we think, as well. One other thing, oftentimes the community was smarter than the rest of the consultants. By the way, the Southwest Corridor Land Development Coalition was part of the group that saw a guy from New York who we thought might be a good guy to run this process. His name was Tony Vangarland. But I'll leave with just one quick anecdote. There are people in this room old enough to remember Mr. Wizard that used to come on, Don Herbert used to come on Saturday mornings. We had a Mr. Wizard moment in the South End one night. We came into the room, Tony was leading our meeting, all the consultants came in, and the idea was to talk about this sound attenuation method we had. It's sort of a series of blinds and all kinds of stuff. We're going to get the sound down to what the VTPR, at that point we were in the environmental impact study, and there was a level of 66 dBA, which was the ambient sound level that you needed to get down to in order to satisfy mitigation measures when the trains ran through. So we were going to run this thing through the South End, and there was going to be that part done. And the community was not happy with the 66 dBA. And when we came into that room, they had tape recorders, they had great big speakers, they had all kinds of stuff going on. And what they had done was tape recorded a faucet. And so as the meeting rolled on, when somebody would stand up to kind of present the ideas for the design of this thing, this noise would come up and go down on roughly the frequency that Orange Line trains would come through the corridor. And as somebody was talking, somebody on the other room would say, well, what did you say? And the person on the other side said, well, I couldn't hear you. And then they had this little dial and said, but it's 66 dBA. Yeah. The result is the section of the Orange Line that is completely covered from Mass Avenue to Back Bay South End Station.
Oh, great.
And another key player in all of this.
David's story is an example of how fortunate it is to have a noise consultant living 4 houses from the railroad track. I've been thinking, as people have been talking about the role of the people with their shoes on the ground, namely the community organizers, and I've thought about that a lot over the years. And come to the conclusion that it's a big help to have an enemy. As in the South End, the Boston Redevelopment Authority was the enemy. And the highways, of course, were the enemy. It's a wonderful organizing function, and I used to worry about what would happen in the South End when the BRA left, and in fact, it did splinter quite a lot. But the organizing that went on because of the highways drew together the most incredible coalition that I think has ever existed, from East Boston to Milton to Lynn to Beverly to Roxbury to South Boston. I mean, a most unlikely Roxbury conglomeration of people and types got together and stayed together in the goal of defeating these highways. And it was really quite an amazing thing. I don't know if we had that kind of capability. I mean, that kind of unifying situation. And in fact, when the Southwest Corridor was built after the victory, one of the reasons that it was built was that South End, Roxbury, and Jamaica Plain had worked together to oppose the highway. And they had committed, when Sargent made his decision, to allow the trains there, to allow the trains and the transit there. And we stuck by that. We didn't change our mind and oppose it. Washington Street was an example of the other thing. There was never any organizing issue for them, and so when it came time to get a light rail, there was no coordination between Roxbury and South End and Chinatown, so it ended up a bust. So that's one of my reflections. Another one is the role of women. The League of Women Voters was very active in the anti-highway movement and provided, I don't know if I got this idea from Alan or not, but as the spokesperson for the Boston League of Women Voters at public hearings, I always had the feeling that I was the respectable edge of the anti-highway movement. Well, that the League was, not me personally. But the women didn't work so hard then, and we had a lot of time to put into things like this, and I think we were quite a contribution to the energy that could go into demonstrating and whatever. And in that regard, I'm interested that when we talk about Alan's getting the money, the interstate transfer money over from the highways to the transit, nobody ever remembers the significant part of that, which was an amendment that the woman representative from New York, Bella Abzug, got added, which allowed it to inflate. The highway money, of course, inflated year by year with inflation, but the transit money was a fixed amount and would not inflate until Bella got into the act and got it inflatable.
That was a year later, separate, another piece of legislation.
Yes,
right?
it was, but it was pretty important.
No, it's very important, very important.
So anyway, those are among my many advocacy reflections. But the other, actually, just one more thing was, I don't know how many of you have gone out to Roxbury Crossing MBTA stop and seen that large enamel plaque which commemorates the history of the movement, and across the top has the names of all of the people involved in the movement. And the first name there is Chuck Turner's, and it's there for a reason, because Chuck, a most unlikely person, and I don't mean that negatively, organized and held together this multifarious coalition in a most incredible way, and he was just crucial. So.
But I think doing that and building on our success, and there's been great success in this city and this state, is a hell of a lot easier than what we faced in the 1960s and 70s. I don't want to sound as if we don't have a lot of work to do here, folks, but I'm really quite optimistic, not only about our ability to find the funds we need to support what we all know we've done and have to continue to do, but because there is, I think, in many ways, a broad consensus. Am I kidding myself, or what, as we look forward? Ian, what do you think?
Ann Lusk, Harvard School of Public Health. Mike, you have guided me for the 10 years I've been in Boston. My PhD's in architecture. All of you, to me, had it easy 40 years ago because, as Ann said, you have many women who were not working. You also had a crisis that you were facing. There was the proposal to build a highway and you wanted to stop it. It's harder today to identify a crisis. Building communities, making them walkable, making cafe tables, having mass transit, having some trees, having some cars, it looks like the solution is there, and we've been doing well for the past 10 years that we've been building this environment. Lancet, the public health magazine, just came out with an issue in July. Physical inactivity is now as critical as smoking. Imagine if we looked at those plaza areas where everybody is sitting and everyone was smoking a cigarette. We would be horrified. There is a measure in public health called a metabolic equivalency of task, a MET. When I came here for mass transit from my little workman's cottage, 1820 workman's cottage, being restored beautifully in Brookline, I walked and I took the T. One MET sitting on the T, a MET of 3 max walking. I walked up the stairs instead of taking the escalator because I knew taking the escalator was 1 MET versus 8 METs walking up the stairs. If I had had a way to bicycle here, it would have taken me a half an hour instead of an hour. And I would have been in the 10 MET range. So you multiply 10 times 30 minutes, and there's 300 MET hours that I've already done just in the morning to get here as a routine part of the day. This is a city of meds, eds, and arcs. If any city is going to do it, this one is, that has so many medical schools, so many places of higher learning, and so many architecture firms. China in 1949, People's Republic of China, all of you know it well, I know you've studied it. They couldn't afford mass transit and they had to industrialize. The one thing they could do was increase the bicycling, which was not high at the time. They subsidized the bicycle manufacturers. They subsidized people to buy bicycles. They built a mass transit system based on the bike by putting in cycle tracks. Their cycle tracks were as wide as 20 feet. They had island buffers that were as wide as 18 feet. They were social cycle tracks because a parent could bicycle beside a child, a college friend beside a college friend, a boyfriend beside a girlfriend. All the social space then that we now take up with those sitting cafe tables and those wide sidewalks. Boston is a city with so many universities. If we looked and we decided to create a very affordable cycle track mass transportation system, we could do it so much more affordably than expanding highways. I want to expand the mass transportation system, but every time anybody bikes, it's 8 to 10 Mets versus 1 to 2 sitting on mass transit, 2 sitting in a car, and max 3 walking. I'm in the same place you were 40 years ago. I need help.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm John Bassett. Thank you, I'm John Bassett. I think the self-congratulatory tone here this morning is right. It's good. You all did a great thing. But for us 46 years ago in Jamaica Plain, it was not easy. We were aware of what was going on in Cambridge, and that was very important. We wouldn't have acted without it. For us, the highway was simply the end of our neighborhood. There was no question about opposing it. The question was whether we had a chance of winning. And what happened then was young people, as was said earlier. There was an existing neighborhood structure. There was a parish centered around the parish. The parish is Our Lady of Lourdes. There were young people getting involved in opposing the Vietnam War. Model cities money was available, and actually the first of the neighborhood health clinics was started in Jamaica Plain by some people. Jack Craddock was the director, Charlie Cordy, and so forth. But this was all happening at the same time, and it was these people, us, who got together and worked on opposing the Southwest Expressway. Finally, it was, for us, a bittersweet victory because, well, it wasn't sweet, it was bitter because, unlike Cambridge, we lost a big piece of our neighborhood. Those houses were torn down, people were scattered, connections were broken. The VRA, who was the enemy and contributed nothing positive to the process at that time, never understood that, shabby though we looked, it was a neighborhood, there were connections, and there was real damage done, there were casualties, and there are ghosts. And this continued, certainly after 1970. I think it may have continued until 1972. And I think that the continuation during the process was too bad and even shameful. But anyway, thank you very much for having this morning. I'm glad to look forward. I just wanted to look back a little bit. Thank you.
I do want to make one clarification. The demolition in the Southwest Corridor stopped immediately when Sargent declared the moratorium. So all the demolition that you saw occurred prior to his February 1970 speech.
I've been told I can only recognize one more person, and while I'd love to recognize my former state legislator, who will tell you why we need to connect North and South Station by rail, and
by bike,
and afford the expansion of and avoid the expansion, unnecessary expansion of more tracks at South Station. And he and I will be happy to do a short seminar afterwards. I don't know whether I should say in deference to age, Mel. I mean, you're still a young guy as far as I'm concerned, but Mel was so deeply involved in this that let's kind of wrap up with Mel King.
It's really...
You're on.
I think a very powerful gathering of folks, given what was accomplished. And we keep talking about where we are now and kind of things that need to happen. It's interesting that the friend from JP raised a question about what had happened to that land. Well, the first piece of legislation that I pushed through was one to have the land given back to the people who the government had taken it from, if they were willing and able to do so. And in several instances, it did happen. Other thing that came out of it was some of the community gardens and the fact that people could take over some of the land and use it to grow. The Roxbury Community College on the land is a direct result of the efforts that we put into making sure that the benefits of the land would accrue to the community. There's an important aspect that we don't focus on, and that is how the people who have resources can take advantage of what the people who ostensibly don't have resources, right? So if you look at what happened with Copley Place, land that was available because of the work in transportation, getting the extension of the Mass Pike, and you can see how, having stopped that highway from coming through that part of the south end, the people with money have been able to take advantage of it, and we have to struggle to make sure that access for folks with limited resources to what gets developed happening. We're seeing it again with Copley Place, where the mayor at one point was not going to allow people whose incomes were low to be part of this new development they want to put up. And so we had to have a little demonstration in his office in order to get him to understand can't do that. All right? So we are not looking at the impact of this over time. Example, the land costs in JP, Roxbury, along the corridor are such that there's a difficulty in putting up housing that is affordable. And so what we're witnessing is the utilization of the land and the resources that we're able to channel going to folks who have needs. And I'll just end this one piece. And I was glad that you talked about the role that Chuck Turner played, because I think it was a spectacular organizing effort that brought those groups together. Yeah, they used to meet at South End House 48 Rutland that I used to run. But the point is that we need to look at the fact that the schools are working. Someone mentioned the fact you want Boston to be a place where people wanted to move. I'd like it to be a place where people who are here aren't getting pushed out. And according to a Metropolitan Area Planning Council report, said that a lot of the folks of color and those low income would be living as far as 20 to 30 miles outside of the city of Boston. All right? Now, we're going to turn that around. And if one of the issues is whether they have access to good education and to schools that work and prepare them, then that's the task that we all have to. We all have to say that all those children are our children, not turn their back on them. Most of the people who do not have children in the schools do not pay any attention to it as if it's part of their family, their community. That's a place where we really got to get together to make sure that people aren't just pushed out because they haven't had the education and the skill to be part of whatever is going to happen or whatever they can make happen as well.
Thanks, Mel. Thank you.
Thank you, okay, we're at the part now where we're going to be giving out some small tokens of our appreciation to some certain heroes of the revolution, as we're calling them. Really, everybody in this room is a hero, and you know it. Please know that. But we wanted to, you have some, Daniel has done a terrific job of finding some archival photos of the heroes, and we're going to be calling them out. What I'd like to do is have you all come up to the front, please, all at once. Please hold your applause, because otherwise we'll be here until noon, and until everybody is assembled, and then we'll take some pictures and reconvene for some good food. And thank you for your patience. This is a terrific setup. Maybe we'll give these all out at the very end. Okay. Okay, who's our first awardee? Oh, that's the last awardee, I thought. Thank you for that. Okay, I'm sorry, of course, Governor Frank Sargent, we were going to end with him, but of course, whose visionary move to stop the highways that Mike Dukakis once called the bravest decision ever made, and accepting as his son, environmentalist and writer, Bill Sargent. I think you want to
I would like to just make one small comment. I know we're running late, but everybody's been long, so I'm going to just make Michael. But we've recognized a number of governors here, but I want to mention one other, and that was Governor Peabody. And there was a blue ribbon panel that said they had to, fix up the DPW, and that he could appoint 5 new members. There were going to be 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. So he looked all around the state to find the 2 Republicans with the least amount of political ambition, and he selected Sargent and Dwight.
Okay, next, Alan Altschuler, of course, from Professor and Task Force Chair and Secretary of Transportation under Frank Sargent. He helped pass the federal law that allowed highway money to be used for public transit. Next. Look at this great picture. Al Kramer, who I'm sorry could not be here today, policy advisor to Governor Sargent, who advocated within the administration for community opponents to the highways. He was sometimes referred to as the Barney Frank of the Sargent administration. And Congressman Barney Frank, who sends his regards.
Oh my gosh.
Neatness isn't everything.
Yeah.
Chief of Staff to Boston Mayor Kevin White, who advocated for community opponents to the highways, and he was sometimes referred to as the Al Kramer of the White administration. Jack Wofford, Executive Director of Governor Sargent's Task Force on Transportation and the godfather of the Boston Transportation Planning Review. Steve Crosby, from organizer to advisor to both Frank Sargent and Kevin White, one-time political rivals, thus beginning his long bipartisan career. Mel, politician, scholar, and activist who, as director of the new Urban League of Greater Boston, organized his community to fight the highway. And Hirschbang, member of the, where is she? The Tubman Area Planning Council, right? That bought the South End Bypass Road and later co-founded the pedestrian advocacy group Walk Boston.
That's right.
Tom Kaufman, I'm sorry, I could not be here today. Who graduated from Jamaica Plains anti-highway movement to East Boston's anti-airport movement, a good friend of mine and kind of a mentor. Charlotte Kahn, check it out. Oh, yeah. A Lower Roxbury community activist at the time who started Boston Urban Gardens, helped beautify the Southwest Corridor, and now runs the indicators report for the Boston Foundation. Governor Michael Dukakis. Even as a state rep from Brookline, he preferred the T to driving. And Fred, beginning in Kevin White's BRA and later Transportation Secretary under Michael Dukakis, his contributions to transportation in Massachusetts are immeasurable. And Tony Bengaro with that nice mustache, of the Southwest Corridor Project, which relocated the Orange Line and redeveloped the highway right-of-way into a 4-mile linear park. And David Lee, architect who helped coordinate the work in the Southwest Corridor and designed stations for the relocated Orange Line. Thank you very much. I am going to turn this over to Stephanie Pollock, who will bring us home.
Thank you. So I just want to, first of all, of course, acknowledge the wonderful folks who are here today. Renee and I started talking about this. Today's actually my last day after 4 years on the BSA board. And Renee, when she first came on board, this was my first pitch. We wanted to do it for two reasons. One is that it's astonishing to me that when Alan Altshuler and I shared a plane ride a couple of years ago, and I asked him, well, what did you do for the 25th, and how many awards have there been? He said, no one has ever done anything to actually ever acknowledge what went on, and I just found that shocking, actually. I wanted to make sure that we didn't have to wait till the 50th, although we could get back together and how things are going. And the second reason is to really energize people, because I think, we heard a lot today about the role that community activism, leadership, vision, persistence, impatience all played in the transformative events that bequeathed to those of us who are here today the Commonwealth that we have and the city that we have. And the crises that we face in 2012 are not as evident and urgent as a highway, but they are as real. They just come in the form of climate change and obesity and lack of access to opportunity and continued poverty, and all of those, the transportation system and the investments that we choose to make or not make are going to decide whether, as a region, as a Commonwealth, we tackle those issues. So our hope in putting this event together was to remind us of what we were capable of and inspire us to be capable of the same great things for the next 40 years. So I hope that as we close, we will once again thank our heroes of the revolution. Thanks to BSA for organizing this. Thanks to Governor Dukakis for moderating it. Thanks to Daniel for all the great work that he did in putting it together. Thanks to the Barrett Foundation for sponsoring it. And I hope that you will join us in the beautiful BSA space, which you have not seen, you definitely want to see, for a reception, so we can continue the conversation and really build on the shoulders of the giants who stand before us and be worthy 40 years from now of the same acclaim that they are worthy of today. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for organizing a beautiful event. This is really terrific. This was really wonderful.
Little League baseball games for me when I was running the South End Boys Baseball League in his brother, Stelian, was a co-worker, and when we were looking for people to referee umpire the game, he said he'd get his brother to come, and we used to play him.
Thank you very much.